Well, good morning. Good morning. Welcome here, friends. Here we are on the long weekend, and you have chosen to spend it with us, talking about Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, no less. So thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining in. If you're new with us, if you're visiting, my name is Paul, and I have the honor of being the lead pastor here at Lakeview. And today, we are concluding our Summer Wisdom series. Now, if you're a kid here with us, often we have a kids program, which will be kicking off in a few weeks here as we have our kickoff next week. But if you're here with us, there are tally sheets just at the back in kind of where you enter, where you can kind of keep track of certain words that if I say them, you check them off. And after the service, you bring those tally sheets to me, and I got some candy for you, which is exciting. Now, some adults have asked, if they do the tally sheets, will they also get candies? Absolutely. Absolutely you will. So if you want to track along and find the words that I'm saying, I see some, no, I don't see it. I was going to say I see some adults running. I don't. But you can keep track and you can keep going with me and you will get some candy from me. All right. We are concluding our series today, and throughout this whole summer, we've looked at 3 wisdom books in the Old Testament. We looked at the book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the book of Job. These books are found in the first part of the Bible that deal with wisdom. And the theme of these books has been all about wrestling with complexities of life with wisdom. The wisdom that is required to navigate all the ups and downs, all the joys and sorrows we find ourselves in, as well as seeking what, where, and when, and how is God's presence in the midst of all of these things, all of our ups and downs. Where is God's presence? What is He doing when we have great days, joyful days? What is He doing when we're feeling down or we have something that just went sideways for us? And one of the things that has been striking as we looked at all 3 of these books, spanning many years, is the comprehensive thinking recorded in these books about life. Generation after generation of people wrestling with how to live wisely and how to navigate all the seasons of life. It is almost, as we looked at all of these writings and all of these complexities and all these things that span time, it is almost as if there's nothing new under the sun. So we started our series back in June with looking at Proverbs, and we looked at the first 7 verses as kind of like a launching pad for us into this series and into Proverbs themselves. And what we learned specifically in verse 7 about wisdom was that fear of the Lord is the foundation of true knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. And we unpacked this verse a little bit to help us understand what the fear word means here. And we came to the place that in light of God's entire story, what this verse is talking about is the reverence and awe of God. In other words, Proverbs began to teach us that wisdom is discovered, pursued, cultivated first and foremost through acknowledgement of God. In fact, we said you could maybe say it this way. You can say acknowledging God is the starting place for wisdom. Only fools reject wisdom and good advice. So throughout the summer, as we listened to insightful teaching from various speakers and our pastoral staff, the reoccurring theme emerged: the fear of the Lord. This deep awe and reverence was consistently highlighted as the foundation of the biblical authors returned to repeatedly over and over. Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, and Job anchor wisdom and the mysteries of life in this truth. If we desire to live wisely, we must begin with God. But of course, how do we do that? How do we begin with God? How do we start with God? I think it'd be fair to say when life is going well, when things are beautiful and joyful, when things are just lining up just right, it's easier to reaffirm that a wise, relational, personal creator invites us into this partnership and relationship and this collaboration with Him. It's a little bit easier to acknowledge God and to start with God when things are going really good. But of course, how do we start with God when life stops going according to plan? When it feels fleeting, like Ecclesiastes has suggested. When things don't last. Or when they don't go the way we expect, as the book of Job reveals. How do we begin with God when things don't line up? What do we do when tragedy strikes? What story do we begin to tell ourselves about life, and maybe more importantly, about God? Last week, we wrestled deeply with the story of Job. If you're not familiar with the story, it is a book that's complex and beautifully written about this man who's righteous and good, and yet tragedy strikes him. And more complexing and maybe befuddling, is that a word? Befuddling? It wasn't in my notes, I just used it. Anyways, but maybe more confusing about Job is that he's good and righteous, and yet God allows for suffering to happen in his life. And there's this character adversary that shows up. And Job loses nearly everything, and is accused by his friends, and finds his wife frustrated with him. And when he cries out and questions God, the response he receives seems bewildering. Job questions God's reasons, design, and justice. And God's response to Job is that he has insufficient knowledge to question God. In some ways, we may be tempted to feel that this whole interaction sort of feels when you were young, or those of you that are kids here, maybe you have this experience, and you ask your parents for something, or you want to do something, and you ask them and they say no, and you're like, well, why not? And they say, because I said so. In some ways, it feels unsatisfying if we just simply look at this interaction that God just says, no, you don't understand all the things I see. But I want to suggest that there's actually much more going on here in this response. I want to suggest that there's actually much more going on in the wisdom books here than simply God saying no. Now, in Job's case, he hears God and he humbly admits. He admits that his narrow thinking that led him to accuse God of injustice. And he even says in the final chapter, we read, he says, you ask, he's saying to God, you ask, who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorance? And Job says, it is I. And I was talking about things I knew nothing about, things far too wonderful for me. So Job, being righteous, man, seems incredibly righteous in this response as well. And he seems very holy in this way of responding to God. And if I'm honest, Job's response feels maybe even superhuman, maybe even out of reach for me. Could I really respond this way in the face of tragedy? And then the book concludes with a short epilogue showing how God restored Job's losses and defends his character to his friends. God says their explanation of justice was inaccurate and clarifies that Job spoke truthfully about him. So in many ways, it seems like it's a confusing interaction between Job and God, and then this nice little ending, I guess. Except it really isn't a satisfying ending. At least not the way I have just described it. Job, despite acknowledging his ignorance of God's mystery and sovereignty, remains a man deeply marked by trauma and suffering. If I force myself into Job's shoes and experience what he has experienced, he's a man marked by significant physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual pain. In this retelling of the story, I can't make sense of how this is just a nice ending, which may leave us and myself with heavy questions. Is God really this flippant about our lives? Does God really just say, you don't get it, so I'll just do this, and one day you'll see that all this suffering, all this bad stuff had a purpose, so just chill? Is that the wisdom we glean from this book? Is that what we ought to take from this ending? Yeah, bad stuff happened, but hey, it all kind of got resolved. Is the wisdom we are to take that God is okay with our suffering? Some of us may be feeling, well, sort of, because this is the way of thinking that has been found in church. We sometimes justify bad things by saying, well, God's in control. And there are theologians that have happily made these arguments. Now, last week, Jessica left us with an important question. She said, when we stare into the face of undeserved suffering, death, destruction, and chaos, are we seeing the face of Creator God, like Job's friends did, who said, you did something, this is why God is punishing you? Or are we seeing the face of his adversary? Friends, this is a really important question for us to wrestle with. Who do we see behind the suffering and pain in this world? Who do we see behind the suffering matters. This question is significant because it shapes our theological imagination. What I mean by that, it shapes our understanding of life and God's part in it. Looking at God's response last week to Job, where God points out that Job doesn't know all the things God knows, may seem unhelpful in light of our trauma and in light of our pain, in light of seeing suffering in our own midst. And it could lead us to make theological assumptions that God is behind the suffering. So then it's somehow okay in eternity. Like, I just don't get it. He's bigger than I, so this will all be okay. And that he causes all of this for his good. And as I said, some make this case. But I don't think that's actually what's happening in Job. I don't think that's what God is teaching us. I don't think that's where wisdom is taking us, in light of God's grand story. And in fact, I want to suggest that the author of Job reveals this to us in God's response in the ending of the book. So, if we take the foundation of wisdom seriously and start with God, as the wisdom books have been suggesting to us all along, we'll learn that God is the author of life. This is where Job's story and our Christian story begins. As wild as the book of Job is, it is part of our story. And for some of us, Job's story is your story right now. We, like Job, faced with all of life's complexities, are rooted in the same story where God is the creator. This is how our Christian story begins, that God is the creator. This is the story of Job. God is the creator. But what kind of creator is he? Well, we learn that God is the one who creates life, a good world, a world established and sustained by him, by his infinite self-giving love. This is Job's story. A world established and sustained by his infinite self-giving love. But we also know that in the grand narrative, in the whole story, something goes wrong. There's a character behind the wrong. Is it God? In Genesis 3, we are introduced to a new character, a character called the serpent, the Hebrew word nachash. What do we know about the serpent? Well, first, he's bad news. This is a creature who is on a mission to disrupt God's good, ordered world. And in the imagery and artistry of scriptures, he is a chaos monster. The serpent is Bible's first portrayal of evil and independence from God. In fact, from this point on, when the biblical authors want to talk about evil, they use artistry and imagery of serpent, dragon, Leviathan. And we learn in this story that the serpent's own chaos mission isn't enough. He also tries to persuade others to join in his chaos. And so the Hebrew understanding of this disruption of God's purposes is that the first humans take the bait. They take the serpent's bait. They take Nachash's bait. And spiritual rebellion behind human rebellion is revealed. And spiritual powers behind earthly evil are revealed. But we also learn in this grand narrative, in Job's story and our story, that God promises that though humanity will be oppressed by this serpent for a time, one day a snake-crushing Savior will come and deliver God's people. So despite this rebellion, God still rules his creation and is always acting to restore peace and justice to it. God's movements are to restore, renew, to do good, to create peace, shalom, and to act justly, to bring justice in the world. Despite the rebellion, God's movements, this good creator, is to do good. So just after 3 pages of the Bible, we've landed on this primary plot, this conflict in the biblical story. God creates and the adversary destroys. Now remember the question Jessica posed for us. When we stare into the face of undeserving suffering, death, destruction, and chaos, are we seeing the face of the Creator? Or are we seeing the face of his adversary? Now, with this primary plot in place in the story that we and Job are part of, we see the disaster always results when humans, who are meant to rule creation, as partners with God, the Creator, join instead with the chaos monster, rebelling against him. But uniquely, Job, in our story, we see someone who's not rebellious, but righteous. He's not following the plot. He hasn't taken the bait yet. He's righteous. Has the Bible lost its plot in Job? I don't think so. Friends, remember that our story starts with the fact that this adversary is rebellious. Its nature is crafty and cunning, looking to destroy. The adversary pursues to ruin Job, testing, tempting, and trying to have Job take the bait that humans in our story have traditionally taken. It is the adversary who causes the suffering. Job reveals to us that none of the suffering or evil in the story of Job is done by God. None. Which brings us to an important part of Job. Last week we heard in chapter 41 of Job, God asked Job a question about Leviathan. Let me read it again. God said, "Can you catch Leviathan with a hook or put a noose around his jaw? Can you tie it with a rope through the nose or pierce his jaw with a spike?" Is God in this story, in this grand narrative as a good creator, is he now speaking to Job simply sarcastically about his power and knowledge compared to Job's understanding and power? I think in light of our grand story, I want to suggest there's much more going on here. In fact, the early church fathers, like the people that came and heard the Jesus story and began to put it into practice, people like Gregory of Nyssa and Origen before him and John Chrysostom, were influential in shaping our understanding of the story, our Christian theology. And they saw what was happening. And they explained that God's plan has always been to renew and to restore the world and humanity from the grip of evil, from chaos monster, from Leviathan. They saw that. And because of that, they described Christ's death on the cross as bait that deceived the adversary, Satan. The one who baits and seeks to deceive and lead us to destruction was himself deceived. The tables have turned, and the adversary takes the bait. Expecting to gain dominion over Jesus, Satan, the chaos monster, was instead overthrown by the resurrection. The adversary took the bait. Satan is the one on the hook. Leviathan, who can catch him? Who can fish for him, God asks. He asks Job, can you draw Leviathan with a fish hook? No, you can't. But don't despair. God can, and God does. God's work and mystery in Job's story, in our story, is that God is destroying death and sin. So yes, the adversary baits and lies, but the bait and the hook has been set for him. And he has taken it. And in the end, he's just a fish on the hook. N.T. Wright put it this way: the violent death of the Lamb has won the decisive victory over the monsters and their horrid kingdoms and over old dragons, the Satan himself. Christ victorious. So yes, wisdom begins with God. This awe and reverence of the fact that this finely tuned universe was created by a wise, relational, and personal creator who not only made us, but also invited us into a partnership, a relationship, a collaboration with him in the renewal of all things. God's goodness and work on the cross was to destroy death and sin, to cast the chaos monster from our presence forever. With its evil grip on the world, because of the resurrection and God's work in our world and our hearts, result is in the chaos monster losing its grip, banished from our presence and God's forever. Friends, when we start with God, wisdom shows us that God is good and that our Lord Jesus Christ did the unimaginable by dying on the cross and 3 days later defeating death through his resurrection. opening the way to new creation. When we start there, when we begin to practice wisdom, when we begin to stop taking the bait of the chaos monster, and when we begin to oppose suffering, resisting evil, trusting that God is destroying it, opening a way to new creation, when we start there, we begin to practice true wisdom. We begin to stop taking that bait of the chaos monster, and instead we begin trusting God with our life, even in the midst of suffering, knowing that God is at work destroying death. So let me return to Job's conclusion. Those of you that know the story, and I just kind of briefly said it, it seems like a nice little ending, but I think there's a lot more going on there. In light of this whole story, in light of this character in Leviathan, who God says, who can catch him? Well, I can. I'm putting an end to this death. In light of this whole story, I think the ending isn't a glib statement about suffering, and it's okay because God will somehow work it out for us, that we don't need to worry about it, or that God will randomly do just what he does. In light of the greater story, it's not random. But rather, Job's conclusion is that the adversary, with all its tormenting, with all its sting and pain and inflicting of suffering on the hearts and on the world, will not have the last word. Job's restoration foreshadows to us that God will not explain the way tears of suffering, but rather that he will wipe away every tear.